Welcome to MetaPod, the podcast where we discuss operational execs and organizations that make and move stuff, and our common headaches, digital transformation, the forever labor shortage, and doing more with less. And now, the host of MetaPod, Ron Crabtree.
So it's Ron Crabtree here, back with another episode of MetaPod, where we talk about the three common challenges that organizations involved with tangible goods all face. It's the forever labor shortage, digital transformation, digitization of work, leveraging cool things like AI, and then finally just having to do more with less of everything. And when we're talking about less, there's lots of pieces to that. Less labor, less emissions, which is partly what our guest here we're talking about, Rich Savoie, in our logistics and supply chain. So this episode is really going to focus pretty deeply around the logistics side of it. And every organization's got a challenge here, right? So you've got all the inbound, right? All the way upstream into your suppliers, your internal operations, and in many cases, fulfillment and supporting your customers for effective fulfillment of product and service into the field at the back end. And Rich is going to get into a pretty deep focus here with us around how do we become more efficient by leveraging AI to not only be much more efficient with labor and help combat the forever labor shortage, but also EHS mandates, right? How do we produce less carbon? How do we get it done with less fossil fuels being burnt and things like that? So Rich is going to share with us some great ideas around how we can use AI optimization to help us get at that and seek effective and then help you to think about more effective methods to manage resource constraints and labor challenges along the way. So with that, Rich, tell us a little bit about you.
Thanks for that, Ron, and thanks for having me on. So my background is actually in engineering, electrical engineering, and I spent about 15 years developing hardware for the medical device industry, so cardiology and cardiovascular products. And what it gave me an appreciation for was the pain of the manufacturing industry and how complicated it is and how much it relies on global supply chain to function, right? So in our world, we were building these devices and we had to source components from all over the world, bits of electronics and hardware and all the other things that go into building a very complicated electromechanical product that needs to be distributed to 50 countries around the world. So you can imagine that if you look at anything in your house, just look around the room and you pick an item and think about how it got into your house and then where it was before that. It was in some distribution center. And then before that, all the components of it had to come together in a manufacturing facility. And then before that, each of those components came from a manufacturing facility. And before that, they came from raw materials, drilled out of the ground or fabricated in a blow molding plastics facility. It's a really massive end-to-end chain just to get even a simple thing like a desk lamp to your house. So I got that appreciation from an engineering perspective and working in that industry. And what I also saw was the slack and the inefficiency in the system, combined with the labor shortage that has been growing and growing in the US and North America and a lot of developed economies as the workforce ages. So that's where I got really excited about the application of AI, automation generally into that industry, because it is, I consider it the backbone of the global economy. Supply chain is the operating system on which everything really runs in the tangible physical world. So being able to address that with new technology and software is just a really exciting opportunity.
That's awesome. I'm really looking forward to some diagnostics. I asked you to think about what are three common threads that any organization involved with, logistics, big consumer of, executor of, whatever, and think about AI application and how it really can impact us in a positive way, both for being efficient with our people, but also, reducing waste. Emissions is a form of waste. Pretend our audience doesn't know a whole lot about logistics. Be careful to define, what you mean by these things. So I may interrupt as you go, but why don't you get into that with us? What are three key areas we should be looking at? How do we measure those? How do we assess if there's a burning platform or a real threat or opportunity? Help us understand that part first.
That's a great framework. So I think about it in these three key areas. Top one being operational efficiency. So how good are your existing processes running inside of whatever you're doing? And as you can imagine, in that world, it's so big, it's so diverse that every organization has its own history and its own way that it's evolved, and their processes have evolved in their own way. And so there's no uniform playbook. Even if you say, how do you make a lamp? Every different lamp manufacturer is going to do it a little bit differently and for a little bit of different market. So it's really key to drill into your own existing organization as it is and understand it really well and understand how efficient it is. So that's kind of the point one. Two is if you are serious about sustainability and emissions reduction and decarbonization, then how does that align with your goals and your targets? Do you have sustainability targets? Do you have KPIs that you're measuring along the way to see if you can meet those targets? And look, if you don't, that's fine. But there's lots of frameworks out there to help set those targets and to figure out what they should be. And then finally, it's taking those things and combining them together into an optimization for the organization to control the resources and to do more with less, as you like to say. So how do we look at our existing efficiency, the resources we have, and how do we use them better? And in the ideal world, in the world that we at Adiona like to prescribe, is how do we then reduce emissions via bringing operational efficiency? That's the key. Financial hygiene and efficiency that then leads to sustainability improvements.
All right. Well, in that case, let's pivot back to each of those one at a time. And let's start with your diagnostic around operational efficiency. What are we looking at? Why are we looking at it? How do we measure that?
One thing that I think, and this is why I love these conversations, it's important to highlight things that people might not know, is that supply chain in general is a massive resource shortage right now globally. So as the population ages in places like the US and Japan and Australia, we're based in Sydney, Australia, by the way. As that workforce ages, people are cycling out, and young people aren't really actively looking for jobs in manufacturing and warehousing and things like that. They're looking for jobs in white collar desk work, software, and things like that. And obviously, AI is now massively disrupting even that industry. But at the end of the day, just look at the stats, right? So in the US alone, there's currently, as of May 2025, 450,000 unfilled manufacturing jobs. So that's nearly 500,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector that people are struggling to recruit. And if you look at transport and warehousing and things like that, 60% of organizations in the US say that they're absolutely struggling to recruit new people to do the work. And that type of work is typically very manual, very labor intensive, very unforgiving on the body. So people don't seek it out, but it tends to pay well. And so there is always a cohort of people that are willing to do it. Again, fun fact, in the US, the number one job for non-college educated males in the US, which is a massive population, is truck driving. And what we see is the costs of a truck driver are going up because it is very hard work and there's less people available to do it. And we see automation coming down the pipe to hopefully help relieve that and change that industry. So the reason I bring up those examples and those stats is because when we talk about this operational efficiency, it's important to remember why we're doing it and to look at, these pressures are only going to increase. The margins of supply chain are already thin. And so being efficient is really important, full stop. But getting a handle on how these processes work in your organization is really fundamental to being able to then improve it and disrupt it with things like AI and automation.
Yeah. So describe how you advocate doing that. How do you get to the data?
Yeah, well, this is another really cool opportunity for AI. When we first started developing AI at Adiona about 5 years ago, the first challenge we were trying to solve was the extract, transform, load problem. So if any of your audience is familiar with big data systems, one of the common struggles still to this day is you've got so much data in so many different systems. And so imagine in a manufacturing or supply chain company producing lamps, just because that's the fun example we're on right now. They've got an enterprise resource system that holds all of their master data. They've got parts and supplier information in a different place, in different format. I worked with one company, a transport company, that because they'd grown through lots of acquisitions, they had 6 different invoicing software systems with a lot of the same customers in them, all totally different data formats. So AI is a great way to normalize all that data. And that's what we were doing at Adiona, is for our transport customers, being able to look and mine all of that data and bring it into a universal harmonized format that you can then work with, right? So that's step one, is how do you normalize that data? And I highly advocate using AI tools and LLMs to help people do that because it is a very efficient way nowadays. And a lot of the general LLMs in the market are very, very good at data manipulation and transformation and normalization. It's kind of a key skill that they have. So, easy to spin up a project inside of a company to say, look, if we're going to ever get serious about this, And when I say this, I mean efficiency, sustainability, resource management. Step one, let's get a handle on our data. And then it doesn't feel so overwhelming once you have that under control. Okay. So that's step one. Get the data together.
Wait a minute, I got a question. I have a question there.
Yeah.
How do you get a handle on where to focus? In other words, talk about understanding which processes rely heavily on manual inputs, for example. So I'm gonna do a quick segue. I've just finished I'm doing some direct consulting with a $1 billion auto supplier, and they were trying to look at what was potential return on investment for a product lifecycle management solution that includes some automation and all these other things. And so we used a tool called value stream mapping, and we went through and we looked at the process of what there's 15 different groups of people involved here. There's engineers, sales, costing experts, go down the list, and we really looked carefully at what are they doing, how long do they take doing it. What's the inbox delay? What's the latent quality performance of the stuff? What's the error rate? And then we were able to roll all these. Oh, by the way, which of the 20 different IT systems are they touching at each step to do that work in the current state? And we were able to do an analysis out of that and learn a couple of things that are really important. One is Pareto analysis, 80-20 rule. We were able to isolate what 20% of all those steps, there's 518 steps in their gating process. I'm sorry, not 518. There's almost 250 steps in their gating process, right? From customer RFQ to actually making parts. And 20% of the steps make up 80% of the human effort, 80% of the delay. So this we were using as a team to go back and say, okay, so from an efficiency perspective, these are the chunks of these processes we've got to figure out how to automate and leverage technology. And then on the other side of it, these are all the different IT systems. Which of these can we roll up? And then how many touches? And that's what you were getting at with the accounts receivable, the billing example. If there's 4 different ways or 5 different ways of doing billing from the different acquisitions to the same customers, that is just flat inefficient. So how deeply do you go into that analysis? I'm trying to understand, are you mainly using the AI tools to help you pull that out? Or are you doing some form of mapping and analysis?
Well, it's a great example, Ron. And since we primarily focus on transport, that's our bread and butter. We think of it from a transport lens. And like you said, looking for the low-hanging fruit and the 80-20 rule to figure out where there's immediate opportunity and then focusing on that immediate opportunity because there's a lot of benefits to just getting started quickly. I think from a leadership perspective, it shows that you're serious about it. And then also, if you can get some wins on the board quickly, it'll motivate the entire team. And then keeping in mind as well that a lot of times these organizations, because they don't have a lot of capital to spend and they're not necessarily the top priority being efficiency, sustainability, because they're just fighting whatever fire they have to fight on a daily basis. It's important to get those runs on the board and show the organization that it can actually benefit them significantly and materially. So another reason to just get going really quickly and get some runs on the board. Now, in order to do that, you do need to be really careful because it can be deceptive. So we were working with a massive FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods company in the food and beverage industry. When we started working with them, they said, this is our problem. And everybody agrees, this is our problem. And of course, when we got in there and we looked through the data, it did not take very long for our system to map those processes in again, the kind of warehousing to distribution transport side of it, to say, actually, no, that's not your problem. That is a problem, but you got a much bigger problem by threefold over here. And so let's focus on that first. And it's also easier to solve.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. So basically you're using the tool to really extract, you're using transactional data, basically. Right? Understand, transactionally what's going on. And so you can extrapolate and pull out of that. What are people really spending their time on? Where the brain is getting involved. And
the other interesting thing in that is sometimes you can see revenue drivers inbuilt in the same system, meaning that like the big opportunity that we just wrote a blog. I've wrote a blog about agentic AI in transport and logistics, specifically because a really common problem you see in this industry is that you might have 10% of your customers that drive 80% of your revenue, but you also might have 10% of your customers that drive the majority of your losses. And not having any kind of insight or calibration on how to manage that margin problem can lead to disastrous results. And we've seen people, go into bankruptcy and administration just because of that. They don't know who are their profit leaders and who are their loss leaders. Realistically, they have a sense for it, but they're wrong. And that's where the data can be so powerful to say, actually, here's the reality and here's where we focus.
Wow. All right, keep going. Sorry for interrupting you. That was really good.
No, not at all. I mean, I'll just say that that's a great segue into the sustainability component as well, because again, if you don't know who's driving your emissions, how can you mitigate it? And how can you align it with your financial priorities? And so what we often see, and what's usually our best friend when we're working with clients, is that a lot of those loss leading activities, it's because they take more time and distance and material and labor than the organization thinks. And so therefore it's not as profitable. It's losing money. And so if we can come in there and help to optimize that process and the way that they deliver to those customers, they can also reduce emissions at the same time as they're reducing time.
So I'm interested in how do you do that diagnostic? What do we need to do to diagnose if there's really an opportunity in the emissions area? Help us understand a little bit more about how do you get at that, determine if there's really an opportunity?
Well, there's also just one point above that, which is that it's becoming mandatory. This isn't becoming optional, right? In markets like Canada, Australia, and soon in the US, it's mandatory for supply chain companies or big organizations generally to report their emissions and their ESG commitments. There's a big movement of anti-greenwashing. Greenwashing meaning where organizations will claim that they're doing something green, quote unquote, and then they're not actually doing it. It's just a marketing tactic that they don't. Oopsie. Yeah, oopsie. And then they walk it back later and everybody seems to forget. And even Amazon is guilty of that. They've taken a lot of their net zero commitments and silently deleted the blogs from their website. And of course, people chase them and call them out on it, but nobody really cares. Nobody's holding them accountable. So anyway, that's more philosophical, but in the reality, it's a matter of, to your question, how do you align those things? And the sustainability component that you want to look at is to say, well, if there are any ways to align the financial hygiene to the emissions, like I'll give you an example. We were working with a company here in Australia that is recycling things like tricky to recycle things in the alcohol industry. They have a lot of liquor stores, bottle shops, whatever you call them. And you can't recycle in your home recycling, you can't recycle champagne corks. And so they were actually letting people drop the champagne corks in a bin at the liquor store, and then they would consolidate them in Melbourne, Australia, and then ship them overseas to be recycled. And what was interesting when we started working with them is that everybody agreed furiously all the way up to the C-suite that that's a great idea and it's a really nice sustainability initiative and it's good for their brand and all that. But when we got in there, we realized that they're collecting, say, 5 kilogram, so about 11-pound satchels of these corks, and then calling for a courier to come and pick them up. Courier is going to come in a van and pick that up, and then it's got to be shipped all the way back to Melbourne. Now, for people who don't know Australia, it's about the same size as the continental US. So it's a really big chunk of land. And so all over the country, these little satchels of 5 kilos are coming back, and then they're going to get stuck onto a container and put on a ship and sent overseas to be recycled. The emissions footprint of all of those logistics movements was arguably offsetting the value of
We would probably be better off to use those corks in our fireplace to make heat, with
literally
the environmental impact being made.
chuck them in your garden and just let them decompose. It's and all the effort and time that went into that for this feel good project, it's really not turning the dial. And that's unfortunate, but you can use systems like ours and like other people's systems to do that simulation from minute one and know that before you even start. And that's the key, right? And we talk about there's this emissions component for every movement and every transaction that you make. And organizations are on the hook. They're required to report them downstream. There's this concept of scope 1 emissions, which is the emissions that you create for your organization directly. So stuff that we're doing right now by talking on Zoom, there's an electricity that we're consuming, and that's creating emissions. We have to be aware of that. But scope all the way down to scope 3 emissions, that's, you're shipping the corks, you're a cork manufacturer, or you're the recycler. What about the trucks that come and pick it up? Those emissions you're responsible for as well. And our platform allows them to see every step along the way, the emissions that they create, and then of course how that's tied to the cost of that transaction. So that's where it all comes together.
Okay, cool. And then I think you wanted to get into another area of diagnostic around effective resource management, right?
Yeah. Well, we talked about doing the process mapping and understanding how the processes work, right? And that's really key to automation because you can't recreate something automatically if you don't understand how it works manually.
Yeah.
And so to get into the resource component, that's where you have to look at how to scale the process. And so if I'm going to look into my resource management and think, well, how can I reduce the amount of resources that I require for these same outcomes? You need to be able to create new processes that are more scalable than what you might already have. That's really hard. And that's where it gets very difficult for some organizations because you need to do it one bite at a time. It's the old kind of Six Sigma lean manufacturing methodology where you really can't just go into a supply chain company that deals in physical world stuff and say, hey guys, you're doing it differently tomorrow. This way you're doing things isn't efficient. So we're just going to reinvent the entire process. It just does not work that way in the real world. So if we want to actually get some of that time back and get those resources back, how do we implement an incremental strategy that aligns with our goals to reduce costs and reduce emissions and gives us a roadmap and gives us some room to fail as well over time? And that's where we really need to be thoughtful and look at the technology options and also be mindful of what technology options are going to be with us for that entire lifetime. As a young company, as a scale-up company, this is where we have challenges sometimes because big organizations know that they're looking down 5, 10, 20-year horizons. And companies that they were dealing with 5 years ago just aren't there anymore, or they've been acquired and merged in with other companies and they're just not the same. So they're very cautious about the technology that they work with, and rightfully so. Point being, my advice to an organization is when you're doing those diagnostics, work with a partner that you believe truly understands your business and will be around for the long haul. And that could still be a young organization, but it has to be one that's so philosophically aligned with the way that you do things that you don't feel a lot of friction there and you feel like you're going to be able to work with them for a long time. It's a marriage, really, looking at these things.
Okay. We did a great job on the diagnostic in these three different areas. So let's pretend the audience is like, yep, that's an area of opportunity for us. It's a challenge. We have a burning platform. Let's get to the meat of this now. What do you do? How do you actually implement a solution to solving those problems? If we could get into that next, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely, Ron. I think, again, step one, getting started quickly by understanding your data is important. And there are so many AI-driven analytical tools and operational platforms that can help to do that now that oftentimes are pretty low cost upfront and can drive an enormous amount of value just in the knowledge and the planning. So I recommend that organizations start to look at the ecosystem of AI tools, modern AI tools, and not necessarily getting to agentic AI yet. They don't need to start there. In fact, I recommend just working with basic LLMs to manipulate their data and nominate somebody to be responsible for it. That's also super important. Get someone that's accountable. It's in their job description that they're on the hook for delivering some efficiency or resource improvements over the next time horizon and make sure that it's in their KPIs. Because in any organization, if it's not in your job description and your boss isn't harassing you about it, it floats to the bottom of the list and you put out whatever fires you are accountable for. So get somebody responsible, start looking at the market of AI tools to start to understand it, and then design some incentives and some KPIs that are based on that Pareto analysis and that low-hanging fruit. So identify some stuff that you think, based on the data and the tools, I think we could save some money here and reduce our emissions. These KPIs line up. Let's take that as a project and just get going on it. That's step one, just get going.
What's next after that?
Well, then it's about, okay, we've gotten started. We're bought in with the team. How are we going to measure this to define success? And there's always going to be a little bit of competitive friction. I think some people might recommend designing those KPIs from zero and from the beginning, but I'm actually not so prescriptive in designing the rules for success right from the get-go, because I feel like that does slow things down. And sometimes it would go back to the champagne cork example. I think, the measures for success should have been kind of earlier in the process, obviously, but not necessarily at the ideation phase, right? So
Yeah. So let me interrupt then. In fact, see, yeah, sure. Just want to ask a question here because my experience over the years, with helping companies transform, and digitize as being a piece of that. So when you think about metrics and stuff, I'll call it leading and trailing indicators, right? Things we want to measure because that's a leading indicator that will get the future performance. And there's a trailing indicator, which would be your finances, right? The actual financial reporting is a way down the road trailing indicator. We did something different. But tell me if this is true and what you've observed that when we're setting metrics, during the first 3, 6, 9 months, as we're standing up some things and getting them rolling, there's certain things we want to control, measure, and drive, but those will actually go away. The need for those goes away as you begin to eliminate and consolidate. And then you're going to have to come up with new metrics and measures as you move to that next stage. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, that's a great point. It is a living system, and those goals and those targets will change, and you have to allow for them to change and be open to that. Otherwise, it's too easy to give up.
Yep.
And I don't know if you've seen that as well. It can really take the air out of the room and out of the system when people say, "Oh, well, we're not meeting these goals." Well, that's time to start having a look at those goals. Are they
Right.
correct? Are there other goals that you should be tracking, or is it truly an embattled problem and you're on the wrong track?
Right.
But
Right.
but be willing to calibrate and readjust as you go.
Okay. Thank you. Good point. Thanks for letting me interrupt.
Oh, of course. No, that's what this is all about. But just to continue on with that, I think once you establish those targets and you do understand that, in our world, I'll give you an example where the simplest one is duration. And what I mean by that, we measure time. Time is money. Everybody knows that. But in the real world logistics sense, it's much, much simpler than in a lot of other industries to measure the value of your time because you've got humans that are doing the work and you know what their salary is and they're on costs. And so you can measure that really cleanly. Now it does fluctuate and it has seasonality and it has different pay models. This is a very contractor heavy industry where you might have a cohort of your own people that work for your company and you understand those costs. But then when Black Friday drops in November and e-commerce goes way, way up, you're hiring all these contractors and people can easily see in the news every year, they talk about how Amazon and UPS and FedEx are hiring these armies of contractors at very high costs. So, the reason I bring that up is that every organization is going to have a level of complexity to their cost model. But if you can tie it all back down to some kind of fundamental metric, whether it's time or whether it's something else, you could start to then understand how to make changes and how those little changes might have a ripple effect and then simulate it. So for any organization, another powerful benefit of AI has been that there's been massive investment in different types of digital twin and simulation systems. We do that for transport, but for any organization, there's oftentimes some systems that can help them process map and at the same time create a simulation environment, a sandbox to then run experiments without going out into the real world yet. So I highly recommend if there is something like that available in your industry, at least have a look at it and do the diligence to see if it actually works and if they have use cases and testimonials
Yeah.
from other
So
similar
some
clients.
jargon I recently heard from, another of our podcast guests recently is talking about a digital twin. And what he was talking about is a much bigger digital twin at the enterprise level. We're looking at all of the drivers of cost. And then inside of that would be very specifically logistics, which is where you're drilling into. So, what you're describing is a form of a digital twin.
Yeah, that's a good point too, is that you can have organizational wide digital twins, and that's a very valuable thing. But I always recommend caution in making sure that whatever tool you're using, if it's a nail, you want a hammer, not a screwdriver, right? You want a
Right.
tool that actually is really perfect for the job that you need done. And oftentimes, as I think people in the software industry especially know, there's a lot of screwdrivers that kind of look like a hammer on the box, but you get in there and you go, this just doesn't work for my industry. They're trying to do too much. They're trying to do everything and be everything to everyone. And sometimes that works. And if you have some money to gamble, that can work. In our industry, though, we try to find things that are just laser focused on the outcomes that you want.
Yep.
And there is a healthy ecosystem of those types of tools out there.
All right. Very cool. Anything else from an advice perspective you would offer our audience that needs to go do something about this?
I would say that if you have a logistics and a component to your business, treat it as its own module. Think of it in a modular design sense where, you've got inputs, you got outputs, you've got interfaces between those things. In my mind, it's an engineering system, and any good complex system is the sum of very good, stable, simple systems. And again, not to wax too philosophically, but I think it's really worthwhile isolating out those modules of your organization and saying, I need to really understand how this works and what drives the costs and what drives the revenue and what drives the margins in this one module. And then I can start to think outside of that. And the reason is because when you get into the details, it's so easy to be distracted. These organizations will just say, for a fun example is a company that does trucking and transport, because they've grown manually over the years. If somebody wants to calculate the costs, just the price to a customer, they'll be like, okay, well, what's your zip code? And how big is the load? And when do you need it? And does it have any special requirements? And all these factors will go in. And then that person sits there with a spreadsheet and works out a cost that's been manually iterated over 20 years. Look, it doesn't mean it's right. It just means that that's the way they've done it, and that's their process. It doesn't mean it's right. But if you want to fix that and you want to fix the inefficiency or the inaccuracy in that process, you have to absolutely understand it first. So separate out all those modules in your business and understand them each individually, then understand how they interface. And you'll be on your way to what is truly a potential for AI disruption in the future, because that's setting you up for success and scalability.
Very good. Anything else on the advice side before we get into the wrap up?
No, Ron, I think I've probably given too much advice. Hopefully people aren't. I guess the only other piece of advice is look for help. If it seems overwhelming and you just don't have anybody on the team, I think it's still a very worthwhile investment to reach out for help. And it doesn't always have to be paid help either. It's using the technology to your advantage to help audit your systems and use tools to do that, and use experienced people like yourself to have a chat with and just understand the problem better.
Yeah. You've done a fantastic job, Rich, of, this whole digital transformation challenge for organizations is hideously complex. And there's so many possible dimensions, but I think you did a really good job of taking this complexity and boiling it down to some very practical ways of looking at the logistics operations, right? All the things involved with moving the stuff, the in, the during, and outbound. And, a practical way of really looking at it with a narrow filter and wrapping our head around it, right? For the average person to make sense of it. So you've done a great job of doing that. So if folks want to learn more about, ask you questions or pick your brain more about this, how do people get in touch with you?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, so they can find me. Just search my name, Rich Savoie, on LinkedIn. And our company, Adiona Tech, like I said, we're based in Sydney, but we're global and work with companies all over the world. So always happy to have a conversation and offer some advice. So yeah, please get in touch.
All right. Awesome. Thank you again.
Oh, my pleasure, Ron. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So if you enjoyed the podcast, we'd certainly appreciate if you would like it and refer it to your friends and follow us and all those other good things, because we don't charge a dime for all this thought leadership stuff we're providing, and we just want the world to be a better place. So thank you for joining me for MetaPod.
Thank you for joining MetaPod. For requests on topics or to ask questions, you can connect with Ron Crabtree 3 ways: via email at metapod@metaexperts.com, via LinkedIn, or by calling him directly at 734-425-1455, extension 103. Lastly, if you love the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. We truly appreciate all your support.